The late afternoon sun spilled through the lace curtains of the old farmhouse, tracing golden streaks across the time-worn floorboards. Grace Ellington stood by the window, her frail hands wrapped around a chipped teacup that had once belonged to her mother. The house was quiet, now too quiet. The laughter that used to fill these rooms had long faded, leaving only the hum of the refrigerator and the soft ticking of the old wall clock. She sighed, gazing out at the field where wildflowers grew untamed. This was the place where she had built her life with Thomas, the man who could fix anything except the passage of time. His memory still lingered in the corners of this home, in the faint smell of cedar, in the soft dent on his favorite chair, and in the garden he'd planted for her the spring before he died. The crunch of tires on gravel broke her reverie. Grace turned toward the sound and saw a familiar car pulling into the driveway. Sophie. Her daughter stepped out briskly, balancing her phone, a leather folder, and a sense of purpose. She looked like she belonged to another world. Sharp lines, pressed suit, polished shoes. Grace smiled softly as she opened the door. "Sophie, sweetheart," she greeted. "You're early." Sophie returned the smile, though her eyes carried a mix of exhaustion and resolve. "Hi, Mom." "Yeah, I wanted to talk to you about something important." Grace's heart tightened. Conversations that began with that tone rarely ended well. "All right," she said carefully, leading her toward the kitchen. They sat at the oak table Thomas had built decades ago. Its surface bore faint scars from family dinners, homework sessions, and birthday candles, a quiet record of life well lived. Sophie set her folder down and exhaled. "Mom, I've been thinking about the house. You said the heating bill's been hard to manage and the roof needs repairs. I know it's not easy living here alone." Grace nodded slowly. "It's not easy, but it's home." "I know," Sophie said, her voice softening. "That's why I wanted to find a solution. One that helps you stay here without worrying so much." Grace watched her daughter closely, that same determined look she'd worn as a child when trying to climb the tallest tree in the yard. "And what kind of solution is that?" she asked. Sophie hesitated. Then she said, almost too quickly, "Don't worry, Mom. I've rented out your room." The words seemed to echo, hollow and impossible. Grace blinked, unsure she'd heard correctly. "You've... what? Just temporarily?" Sophie rushed on. "It's a good arrangement, I promise. The tenant's respectful, quiet, and pays well. You'll stay in the guest room for a while. I already had it cleaned and set up." Grace set her cup down, her hand trembling just slightly. "My room, Sophie? That's..." She paused, her throat tightening. "That's not just a room. That's your father's room. Mine. Ours." "I know, Mom," Sophie said quickly, her voice gentle but firm. "But you have to think practically. It's just for a few months. Once the repairs are done and you're financially steady again, we'll see." Grace looked at her daughter, really looked at her. Beneath the polished confidence, she saw the faintest flicker of guilt. "When does this person move in?" she asked quietly. Sophie avoided her gaze for a heartbeat too long. "Tomorrow morning." Grace's eyes widened. "Tomorrow? Sophie, Mom, please." Sophie interrupted softly, reaching across the table. Just trust me. You'll like him. He's decent. You'll see." Grace wanted to protest, to remind her daughter that trust wasn't something to be handed out so easily, not when her own home was being rearranged without her say. But she saw the pleading in Sophie's eyes. That same look she'd had when she was little, when she'd broken her father's watch and promised to fix it. Grace had forgiven her then, and maybe she would forgive her now too. That night, Grace walked through the house like a stranger, tracing the walls of her own memories. She touched the worn edges of picture frames, Sophie at 6 years old with cake on her nose, Thomas holding her on his shoulders by the lake, their wedding photo framed in dusty glass. She stopped in the doorway of her bedroom, the room she would have to leave. The scent of lavender hung in the air from the sachets she kept in the drawers. The moonlight spilled across the quilt she'd sewn by hand. Grace sat on the edge of the bed, running her fingers over the stitches, remembering the nights she and Thomas had stayed up talking until dawn, dreaming of the future. Tomorrow, a stranger would sleep here. For the first time in years, the house no longer felt like hers. Still, before she turned off the light, she whispered softly to the darkness, "All right, Thomas, let's see what tomorrow brings." Outside, the wind stirred the tall grass. Somewhere down the road, a single headlight cut through the night, a car making its way toward the Ellington farmhouse, carrying someone who would soon change everything. The morning arrived in a veil of gray mist. Grace woke before dawn, unable to sleep. The house felt heavier somehow, as if it too sensed something changing. She dressed quietly and made her way to the kitchen, the scent of brewing coffee filling the air. For years, mornings had been her sanctuary, the gentle hum of the kettle, the sound of birds outside. But today, even the birds seemed to sing softer, unsure. She set out 2 mugs by habit, only to realize one would remain untouched. A small ache pressed at her chest. She'd kept Thomas's cup in the same spot since he passed, just beside hers, handle facing outward, as if he might return for one last morning together. A car door closed outside. Grace straightened, her hand trembling slightly as she brushed a strand of silver hair behind her ear. Through the lace curtain, she saw a man stepping out of a modest sedan. He looked to be in his late 30s, tall, but with a quiet posture that spoke of humility more than confidence. His dark hair was neatly kept, his clothes simple, a gray sweater, jeans, and a worn leather satchel slung across his shoulder. Sophie followed behind him, waving. "Morning, Mom," she called, her tone too bright, too rehearsed. Grace opened the door, forcing a small smile. "You must be the tenant?" The man nodded politely. "Nathan Carter, ma'am. It's nice to meet you." His voice carried a soft steadiness, polite but with something heavy beneath it, like a man who'd learned the weight of silence. Grace offered a restrained nod. "Well, Mr. Carter, welcome to the Ellington house. Sophie said you'd be moving in this morning." He smiled faintly. "Please, just Nathan. And yes, thank you. I really appreciate this." Sophie clapped her hands together, her energy cutting through the stiffness. "See, Mom, perfectly polite. I told you he'd be wonderful." Grace managed a smile. "We'll see." While Sophie helped Nathan bring in his things, just 2 suitcases and a box of books. Grace lingered in the hallway, watching. There was something about him, a quietness that didn't feel uncomfortable, yet familiar somehow. Nathan paused by a photograph hanging on the wall. Thomas standing beside his old fishing boat, beaming at the camera. He looked at it longer than most would. "He was your husband?" he asked gently. Grace nodded. "Yes, Thomas. He built most of this house himself. Every inch of it has his hands in it." Nathan's expression softened. "It's beautiful. You can tell it was built with love." The words struck her simple but sincere. Sophie glanced between them, sensing the emotion in her mother's eyes. "I'll finish setting up the guest room for you, Mom," she said, quickly shifting the moment. By afternoon, the transition was complete. Grace's belongings were neatly packed into the smaller guest room at the end of the hall, the one that faced away from the fields. It wasn't unpleasant, but it lacked the warmth of her old space. Her favorite window view was gone. The familiar rhythm of light and shadow she'd known for decades had changed. Nathan kept to himself mostly. He spent the first few hours unpacking and setting up an old typewriter by the window. The sound of its keys soon became part of the house's quiet symphony, a new rhythm Grace couldn't ignore. That evening, as Sophie prepared to leave, she kissed her mother's cheek. "I'll come by next weekend, okay? Call me if you need anything." Grace forced a smile. "Drive safe, dear." When the sound of Sophie's car faded down the road, the silence returned, this time deeper. Grace stood by the kitchen counter, unsure whether to make dinner for one or two. Her eyes wandered toward the closed door of what used to be her room. She could faintly hear the typewriter keys. A strange comfort lingered in the sound. Hours passed. As the night deepened, Grace found herself sitting on the porch, wrapped in her shawl, staring at the faint glow of Nathan's lamp through the curtains. She was used to solitude, but this was different. A quiet shared with someone unseen, someone who didn't fill the silence but didn't disturb it either. She thought of Thomas again, how he'd always said, "You can tell a lot about a person by how they handle quiet moments." Nathan seemed like someone who'd known a lot of quiet. The next morning, Grace found a small note on the kitchen counter beside a steaming cup of tea. "Good morning, Mrs. Ellington. I made you some tea. Hope that's all right. Nathan." She blinked, surprised. The handwriting was neat, almost old-fashioned. She took a sip, warmth spreading through her chest. It had been years since someone had made her tea without asking. That afternoon, as Nathan was tending to his things outside, Grace walked past his open door and paused. Inside, she noticed an old photograph on his desk, a young woman holding a little boy. The faces were blurred with time, but something about the woman's eyes tugged at Grace's heart. Nathan looked up and caught her gaze. For a brief second, their eyes met, and she saw something raw there. Something unsaid. He smiled faintly. "Just my mother," he said quietly. "She passed a long time ago." Grace nodded, her throat tightening. "I'm sorry." "Don't be," he murmured. "She'd have liked it here. Peaceful, real." Grace hesitated before stepping back. "If you ever need anything, Nathan, you can just ask." He looked at her for a moment longer than necessary, then said softly, "Thank you, Mrs. Ellington. That means a lot." That night, as she lay in her new room, Grace couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this man than met the eye, and that somehow, in ways she couldn't yet name, his arrival was not a coincidence at all. The days that followed carried an unfamiliar rhythm, one that Grace found both unsettling and strangely comforting. Nathan Carter settled into the house like a shadow that didn't demand to be noticed. He was quiet, respectful, and tidy, always keeping his door half open when working, as if he wanted the world, or perhaps Grace, to know he had nothing to hide. Grace, in turn, kept her distance at first. She told herself it was because she didn't want to intrude, but truthfully, it was because she was afraid of growing attached. She had grown used to solitude. It had become her shield against disappointment. But slowly, life began to change in small, imperceptible ways. Each morning, Nathan would leave the house at the same time, a notebook tucked under his arm. He never said where he was going, only offered a polite nod and a "Good morning, Mrs. Ellington." By the time he returned in the afternoon, he'd bring back something, sometimes groceries, sometimes wildflowers from the field, once even a bundle of fresh bread from the bakery in town. And every evening, without fail, there'd be a soft knock on the kitchen door. Nathan would appear with 2 cups of tea. "Figured you might need one," he'd say, his smile faint but genuine. Grace found herself looking forward to those quiet exchanges more than she cared to admit. They never talked much, just enough to fill the silence. He'd ask about the history of the house, about the garden, about Thomas. She found herself answering piece by piece, like someone relearning how to trust their own voice. One rainy afternoon, the power went out. The farmhouse dimmed into shadow, and Grace lit a few candles, their flames trembling like nervous hearts. Nathan appeared at her door with a flashlight. "Everything all right?" he asked. "I'm fine," she said, smiling softly. "Just not used to the dark anymore." He hesitated before stepping inside. "You remind me of my mother," he said quietly. She used to say the same thing whenever a storm came through. Grace tilted her head. "You talk about her often. You must have been close." "I was," he admitted. "She passed when I was 16. After that, I moved around a lot, foster homes, odd jobs. Writing was the one thing that made me feel grounded." "You're a writer?" she asked, intrigued. He smiled faintly, trying to be. "I used to write articles for a small paper, but lately I've been working on something more personal. A memoir of sorts." Grace nodded thoughtfully. "Your typewriter. That's what the sound is every night, isn't it?" "Yeah," he said, chuckling softly. "Hope it's not keeping you up." "Not at all," she said. "It's comforting, actually. Like company without conversation." Nathan's eyes softened. "That's exactly what I'm trying to write, about the kind of silence that still speaks." Grace smiled. "Then I think you've found the right house for it." For a while, they sat together in the flickering candlelight, listening to the rain strike the windows. There was something deeply human about it. Two souls quietly acknowledging their loneliness without needing to fix it. Later that week, Sophie returned for her usual visit. She was dressed impeccably as always, her perfume filling the air as she breezed through the door. "Mom, how's it going? Everything okay with the new arrangement?" Grace hesitated. "It's different, but I'm managing." "And Mr. Carter?" Sophie asked, pouring herself some tea. "He's behaving? No trouble?" Grace frowned slightly. "He's been nothing but polite, Sophie. Thoughtful, even." Sophie smiled, but there was an edge to it. "Good. I just wanted to make sure he seemed quiet. You never know these days." Grace gave her daughter a look that same firm, motherly gaze Sophie had known since childhood. Sometimes quiet people carry more goodness than the ones who talk too much. Sophie raised her hands in mock surrender. All right, I'll take your word for it." But as she left later that evening, Grace noticed something of faint tension in Sophie's posture, the way she avoided meeting Nathan's eyes. Something unspoken passed between them, and Grace felt a flicker of unease. That night, she couldn't sleep. The wind outside rattled the windows, and the house creaked as if whispering secrets. She rose quietly and stepped into the hallway, her slippers barely making a sound on the wooden floor. From the crack beneath Nathan's door, she saw the faint glow of lamplight. Curiosity tugged at her, and before she could stop herself, she knocked softly. "Come in," came his gentle reply. Nathan sat at his desk, a stack of papers beside him, his typewriter resting like a relic between worlds. He looked tired, eyes shadowed but kind. "I'm sorry if I'm intruding," Grace said. "I couldn't sleep." "Neither could I," he said, gesturing for her to sit. She hesitated, then lowered herself into the chair by the window. For a moment, they just sat there, listening to the wind. Then Grace's eyes drifted toward the papers. "Is that your memoir?" He nodded. "It's about finding home, or trying to. Not the kind made of walls and wood, but the kind that makes you feel seen." Grace smiled faintly. "You're very young to understand that." Nathan looked down at his hands. "Maybe. But when you've lost enough, you start to learn what home really means." Something in his tone, that quiet ache, made Grace's heart twist. She saw a reflection of her younger self in him, someone who had loved deeply and lost quietly. Before leaving, she said softly, "I hope you find what you're looking for, Nathan." He looked up, meeting her gaze. Maybe I already have. Grace paused at the doorway, a strange warmth blooming in her chest. She didn't know why, but his words lingered long after she'd gone to bed, like the echo of something she wasn't ready to name. The next few weeks unfolded with a gentle steadiness, as if the house itself had begun to breathe again. The seasons were shifting, the days grew shorter, the air crisper, and every morning brought with it the scent of autumn leaves drifting through the open kitchen window. Grace Ellington found herself falling into a quiet routine that revolved not around loneliness, but around subtle companionship. Nathan Carter had become part of that rhythm. He would often help with the garden, trimming back the overgrown vines that had begun to creep along the fence. He'd fix the squeaky door hinges without being asked, repair the steps on the porch, even replace the burnout bulbs that Grace had learned to ignore. "You don't have to do all that," she told him one morning, smiling as she handed him a cup of tea. "I like keeping busy," he said, accepting it gratefully. "Makes me feel useful." Grace chuckled softly. "You already are, Nathan. You've brought life back into this place. I didn't realize how quiet it had gotten until you arrived." Nathan met her gaze with a gentle smile. "Then I'm glad I came when I did." There was something so steady, so grounded about him. He didn't fill the air with meaningless talk, he simply was, and somehow that was enough. One afternoon, as the two of them sat on the porch peeling apples for pie, Nathan glanced at her thoughtfully. "Do you ever regret staying here?" he asked quietly. "In this house, I mean." Grace paused, the question catching her off guard. "Regret?" she repeated. "No, I don't think so. This house holds everything I love, everything I've lost. Leaving it would feel like erasing them." Nathan nodded slowly. "I understand that." She tilted her head. "Do you?" His eyes flickered to the field beyond the fence, where the wind moved like water through the grass. "Yeah," he said, after a long pause. "Sometimes places are the only things that remember us when people can't." There was a sadness in his words, one that Grace recognized too well. She wanted to ask more, but something told her that if she did, he might retreat into silence, and she didn't want that. That evening, after dinner, she found him sitting at the kitchen table, scribbling something in his notebook. Curiosity got the better of her. "What are you writing tonight?" she asked. He hesitated before replying. "A chapter about my father." Grace smiled gently. Was he a writer too? Nathan's expression darkened slightly. "No, he left when I was young. I don't remember much of him, just a few pieces. The sound of his voice, the way he used to whistle." Grace's heart softened. "And your mother?" "She tried her best," he said. "Worked too many jobs. Always tired, always smiling anyway." He gave a small laugh. "She used to tell me stories about this little town, said it was where her life changed. I never asked how." Grace's fingers froze on her teacup. "This town?" she repeated slowly. He nodded. "Yeah." She said she'd met someone here once, someone kind, who helped her when she needed it most. I don't know who that was, but I've always wanted to see it for myself, to understand what she meant. The air between them grew still. Grace's pulse quickened. Something in his story stirred a memory, faint and flickering. Years ago, Thomas had once told her about helping a young woman who'd broken down near the old bridge one winter night. A single mother, he'd said. Grace had never thought much about it since. Now, looking at Nathan, something in her chest tightened. Not fear, but recognition. "Your mother," she said softly. "What was her name?" Nathan hesitated. Laura Carter." Grace's breath caught. The name struck a chord deep in her memory. Yes, that was it. Thomas had mentioned her by name that night, decades ago, when the snow fell thick and the world seemed suspended in silence. She hid her trembling hands beneath the table. "She sounds like she was a good woman," she said gently. "She was," Nathan replied. She didn't talk much about the past, though. When she got sick, I tried to ask, but she just smiled and said, "Some stories aren't meant to be finished by us." Grace swallowed hard, her throat suddenly dry. Later, when Nathan went to bed, Grace sat alone at the table, her heart pounding with a strange mixture of sorrow and curiosity. Could it be? Could this quiet young man be connected to her husband's past in a way she'd never imagined? She rose slowly and went to her old cedar chest in the guest room. Inside were boxes of memories, photographs, letters, and keepsakes she hadn't touched in years. She pulled out a faded envelope, one that had always puzzled her. It was addressed to Thomas Ellington, written in a delicate feminine hand. She opened it. The letter was brief, the ink faint but legible. "Dear Thomas, I don't know how to thank you for what you did that night. You didn't just fix my car, you gave me hope when I had none left. I don't know where life will take me, but I'll never forget your kindness. If you ever find yourself in the city, there's a boy who should meet the man who helped save his mother. With gratitude, Laura Carter." Grace's hand trembled as she read the signature again. Laura Carter. She stared at the letter for a long time, the pieces fitting together like fragile glass. Nathan wasn't just any tenant. He was the son of the woman Thomas had once helped, the woman who had carried that act of kindness with her until the end of her days. Grace sank back into her chair, tears pricking her eyes. The universe, it seemed, had a way of circling back, of delivering unfinished stories to the doorstep of those who needed closure most. Down the hall, the faint clack of Nathan's typewriter began again, steady and soft, the sound of history rewriting itself in the quiet of the night. And for the first time in years, Grace didn't feel alone. She felt connected to the past, to Thomas, and to this stranger who somehow wasn't a stranger at all. Grace hardly slept that night. The letter sat on her nightstand, the ink shimmering faintly in the soft moonlight, as if it had waited decades to be read. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the words again. There's a boy who should meet the man who helped save his mother. Nathan Carter was that boy. By morning, Grace felt the weight of 1,000 untold stories pressing against her chest. She made tea, her hands trembling slightly as she placed the letter on the kitchen table. Outside, the mist was lifting, sunlight spilling over the fields like forgiveness finding its way back home. Nathan appeared in the doorway, hair tousled, eyes heavy with sleep. "Morning," he said softly. "You're up early?" "I couldn't sleep," Grace replied, her voice quieter than usual. "Sit, Nathan. There's something I think you should see." He hesitated but obeyed, curiosity flickering in his eyes. Grace slid the envelope toward him. "I found this last night. It was addressed to my late husband, Thomas Ellington." Nathan studied the handwriting before opening it carefully, as if the paper itself were sacred. His eyes scanned the words, and slowly, his breath hitched. He looked up. This is my mother's handwriting?" Grace nodded, tears glistening in her eyes. "Thomas told me once, years ago, about helping a young woman stranded near the old bridge. Her car had broken down in the snow. He fixed it, made sure she got home safely. He said she had a baby sleeping in the back seat." Nathan's hand trembled slightly. "That was me." The room went still. Grace reached out, placing her hand gently over his. "I think it's no accident you ended up here, Nathan." He swallowed hard, struggling to speak. "All these years, I wondered why she talked about this town like it was some kind of miracle. She never told me the man's name, only that he had kind eyes and hands that looked like they'd built things that mattered. She said he'd reminded her that not all people walk away. Grace's throat tightened. That sounds like him? Nathan's eyes glistened. She kept that hope her whole life. She'd tell me, one day, the world will bring you back to where you're meant to be. Maybe she was right. Silence hung between them, not heavy but full. Grace could almost feel Thomas's presence in the room, the warmth of his quiet smile. After a long moment, Nathan spoke again. If you don't mind, could I see a picture of him? Grace rose and crossed the room to the mantel. She lifted a framed photograph of Thomas, standing proudly beside the garden, sun spilling across his weathered face. She handed it to Nathan. He stared at it for a long time, eyes glistening. That's him, he whispered. I know it sounds strange, but I've dreamed of this face before. I was a child, and my mom would describe him to me. I think my mind held on to that image. Grace smiled softly through her tears. Maybe your heart did. They sat there, two souls connected by a thread spun years before either of them understood its meaning. Later that day, Sophie arrived unexpectedly. Her voice carried through the house before she appeared in the kitchen doorway. Mom, I wanted to... She froze at the sight of Nathan holding the letter. What's that? Grace turned, her tone calm but firm. Something you didn't know. Sit down, Sophie. Sophie's brow furrowed, but she obeyed, glancing between them. What's going on? Grace took a breath. The man you rented my room to? He isn't just a tenant. He's the son of a woman your father once helped. The woman wrote him this letter. Sophie blinked, confusion giving way to awe. Wait, what? How is that even possible? Nathan spoke softly. My mother used to talk about this place, about a kind man who saved her life one winter. I didn't know his name until now. I didn't even know this was the same town. Sophie's expression softened. That's incredible. She looked at her mother, eyes misting. It's like Dad sent him here. Grace smiled faintly. That's what I've been thinking. The three of them sat together, and for the first time in years, the farmhouse felt alive, not with sound, but with connection. The walls that once held memories now seemed to hold meaning again. That evening, Nathan stood by the porch railing, watching the sunset bleed into the horizon. Grace joined him, a shawl draped over her shoulders. You know, she said softly, Thomas used to say life's kindness has a way of circling back, sometimes years later, sometimes when you least expect it. Nathan smiled faintly. Then maybe I'm proof of that. Grace looked out at the fields, the colors glowing like embers. Or maybe you're the reminder I needed that even loss can lead to something good. He turned toward her. Mrs. Ellington, would it be all right if I wrote about this? Not just for my book, but for her, for both of them. Grace's lips curved in a tender smile. I think they'd both like that, very much. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the farmhouse bathed in gold. Nathan took a deep breath, the kind that fills not just the lungs, but the heart. For the first time in years, he felt anchored not to a place, but to a truth he'd finally uncovered. Inside, Sophie was setting the table for dinner, 3 plates this time, not 2. The clinking of dishes and the smell of roasted vegetables filled the air, wrapping the house in warmth. Grace looked toward the doorway, her eyes soft with contentment. It's strange, she said quietly. I thought renting out my room would mean losing something, but maybe I was just making space for what was meant to return. Nathan smiled. Maybe home isn't where you start. It's where you're led back when you're ready to see it. And in that quiet twilight, surrounded by the echoes of memory and the promise of something new, Grace Ellington realized that her husband's kindness had never truly left this house. It had simply been waiting for its way home. The days that followed carried a calm unlike any Grace Ellington had felt in years. It was as though the house itself had exhaled, releasing years of silence it had been holding in. The walls, once heavy with stillness, now seemed to hum faintly with life laughter from the kitchen. Footsteps in the hallway, the quiet rhythm of a typewriter tapping out something beautiful and true. Nathan Carter had become more than just a tenant. He was part of the family's rhythm now, without even trying. He helped Grace carry groceries, repaired the old greenhouse behind the barn, and sometimes joined Sophie for dinner when she visited on weekends. It was natural, unforced, as if he had always been there, just waiting for the right moment to arrive. Sophie, for her part, seemed to soften too. The sharp edges that once framed her voice had begun to round. She lingered longer on visits, stayed for breakfast, helped her mother with small chores she used to rush through. Grace could see it in her eyes. The guilt that had lingered since her father's passing was beginning to fade. Nathan's presence, gentle and constant, had brought something back to both of them that Grace hadn't realized they'd lost. Peace. One Sunday afternoon, the three of them sat in the living room. The fire crackled softly, casting golden light over the worn photographs on the mantel. Nathan was flipping through one of Thomas's old sketchbooks, the one filled with plans for repairs he never got to finish. "These are incredible," Nathan murmured. "Your husband must have been a brilliant man." Grace smiled. He was, but he was humble about it. Said building things was the only way he knew how to say, "I love you." Nathan looked up, eyes thoughtful. "Maybe that's what I've been trying to do too, in my own way. Writing, I mean, trying to build something lasting." Sophie looked at him curiously. "How's the book coming along?" He smiled faintly. "Better now? For a long time I couldn't find the ending, but I think I know it now." Grace tilted her head. "And what ending is that?" Nathan's voice softened. "That home isn't always a place we're born to. Sometimes it's the place that forgives us before we even know we've arrived." The room went quiet, the only sound the soft pop of wood in the fire. Grace's eyes glistened, her hand resting on the arm of her chair. Later, as Sophie drove back to the city, Grace stood on the porch beside Nathan, watching the taillights fade down the long dirt road. The evening sky was painted in strokes of rose and gold. "She's changing," Grace said quietly. "Sophie, you've been good for her." Nathan shook his head. "She's been good for me." "You both have." Grace smiled, her eyes soft. "Do you ever think about staying?" He looked out at the horizon, hands tucked in his jacket pockets. "I've thought about it more than I should, but I don't know if I belong anywhere permanently. I've always moved from place to place, like I'm chasing something I can't name." "Maybe it's not something you're chasing," Grace said gently. "Maybe it's something that's been trying to find you." He turned to look at her, and for a brief moment, the air between them felt charged with a quiet understanding, something that didn't need to be spoken to be felt. That night, Nathan sat by his typewriter long after Grace had gone to bed. The lamp cast a soft circle of light across the desk as he typed, the steady rhythm filling the house with warmth. The story was finally flowing, his story, his mother's, and now somehow Grace's too. He titled the manuscript, "The House That Remembered." Each page told a part of the journey of his mother, lost but hopeful, of a man named Thomas whose kindness rippled through time, of a woman named Grace who had unknowingly held the missing piece of that story for decades. And as he wrote, tears welled in his eyes. For the first time, the words didn't feel borrowed, they felt true. The next morning, Grace found him asleep at the table, his head resting on his folded arms beside the typewriter. She smiled softly, draping a quilt over his shoulders before glancing at the manuscript. The top page read, "Some houses keep secrets, others keep promises. This one kept both until the day it finally opened its doors again." Grace stood there for a long time, her heart swelling with something she hadn't felt in years. Pride. Yes, but also gratitude. She whispered quietly to the empty air, "You'd be proud of him, Thomas. You really would." In the days that followed, Nathan began sending out his manuscript to publishers. Grace encouraged him, even though a small part of her feared what would happen if he left. Still, she knew what Thomas would have said. Let him find his way. That's what home teaches us to do. One evening, as they sat outside watching the stars bloom across the indigo sky, Nathan turned to her. "I got an email today," he said quietly. Grace looked up, smiling. "Good news, I hope?" He nodded slowly. "A publisher's interested. They want to meet me in the city." "That's wonderful, Nathan," Grace said, though her smile wavered slightly. "You must be proud." "I am," he said softly. "But I'm also scared. It feels like leaving something behind that I'm not ready to let go of." Grace reached over, placing her hand on his. "You're not leaving, Nathan. You're carrying it with you. This house, these stories, they'll go wherever you do." He looked at her, then really looked, and for the first time Grace saw in his eyes not the boy who had lost too much too soon, but a man who had finally found where he belonged. The crickets sang softly in the field, the stars shimmered above them, and for a long time neither of them spoke. Because sometimes words weren't needed. Sometimes it was enough to simply be two souls, quietly mending the spaces where time had once torn them apart. The following week unfolded with the slow, tender rhythm of a farewell that neither wanted to name aloud. Nathan's meeting in the city was only a few days away, and while both he and Grace tried to go about their routines as usual, an unspoken awareness hung between them that change, once again, was coming. Grace found herself lingering in the small moments, the sound of his typewriter in the mornings, the way he hummed softly when he worked in the garden, even the way he leaned against the porch railing at sunset, always with a cup of tea in his hands, like he'd been there all his life. She didn't say it out loud, but she knew she'd miss him. Not just for the company, but for the quiet way he'd made the house feel alive again, as though Thomas's kindness had returned through another soul, wearing a different face, but carrying the same heart. On Tuesday afternoon, Sophie stopped by. She was smiling as she stepped into the kitchen, holding a bouquet of lilies. "Mom," she said, "these are for you." And she turned toward Nathan, "For the author in residence." Nathan laughed, rubbing the back of his neck. "Thank you, but I think I'm just a guest who types a lot." Sophie grinned. "Mom told me you got a meeting with a publisher. That's incredible." He nodded modestly. "It's exciting, yes, a little terrifying too." "Good," she said. "Terrifying means it matters." As Sophie talked, Grace noticed something that made her smile the way her daughter looked at Nathan when she thought no one was watching. It wasn't romantic, not exactly, but it was different, a kind of quiet admiration that softened her usually guarded demeanor. Grace said nothing, only tucked the thought away like a secret between heartbeats. After dinner, when Sophie had left, Grace and Nathan sat by the fireplace. The flames danced low, shadows flickering along the walls. "Do you ever think about what happens after a story ends?" Nathan asked suddenly, breaking the silence. Grace smiled. "Always. But I think good stories never really end. They just find new narrators." He chuckled softly. Then maybe you should have been a writer too. I was once, she said, eyes glinting playfully. At least in my journal. Thomas used to say I could turn a grocery list into poetry. Nathan smiled. Then I'd say he was a wise man. Grace's gaze softened. He was. And so are you, Nathan. There was something in her tone. Something tender, maternal, yet deeply personal. It carried gratitude, affection, and the quiet ache of knowing that soon the house would lose its newest heartbeat. That night, Nathan stayed up late packing. His suitcase wasn't large, and his possessions were few: a notebook, his mother's photograph, and the now finished manuscript that had changed everything. He looked around the room, his eyes landing on the framed picture of Thomas Grace had given him earlier that day. He smiled faintly. "Thank you," he whispered to the photo, "for everything." The next morning dawned bright and clear. Grace had woken early, made breakfast, and brewed his favorite tea. Nathan joined her at the table, freshly shaven, dressed in a neatly pressed shirt. He looked every bit the author he was becoming. "You don't have to go," Grace said quietly, not as a plea, but as a truth she wanted to release. Nathan smiled gently. "If I didn't, I think you'd scold me for not chasing what's mine." She laughed softly, brushing a crumb from the table. "Maybe I would, but I'd still miss you." "I'll miss you too," he said. Then, after a pause, he added, "I don't think I've ever had a home that felt like this. Or people who felt like family." Grace reached across the table and took his hand. "That's what family does, Nathan. It finds you when you're ready for it." When it was time to leave, Nathan carried his bag to the car, pausing at the porch steps. He turned back to look at the farmhouse, the white paint chipped in places, the garden wild with autumn color, the curtains fluttering softly in the breeze. Grace stood in the doorway, her shawl draped over her shoulders, smiling through tears. "Don't forget to write," she said. He grinned. "I wouldn't dare." Then, almost hesitantly, he stepped forward and hugged her, not briefly but deeply, like a son saying goodbye to the only mother figure he'd ever known. "Thank you," he murmured, "for giving me something I didn't even know I was looking for." She held him tighter. "You didn't find it, Nathan," she whispered. "You brought it with you." When the car finally disappeared down the road, Grace stood there for a long while, her eyes on the horizon. The silence that followed wasn't empty anymore. It was full of laughter, words, memories, and the faint hum of a typewriter that seemed to echo in her mind. Later that evening, Sophie called. "How are you doing, Mom?" Grace smiled as she stirred her tea. "I'm all right, darling. Just thinking." "About him?" Sophie asked. "Yes," Grace admitted softly. "About him. And about your father. I think they'd have liked each other." Sophie's voice grew tender. "I think you're right." After the call, Grace went to her late husband's old chair and sat down. The letter from Laura Carter was still tucked in her pocket. She unfolded it one last time, running her fingers over the faded ink. "Thomas," she whispered, "you always said kindness has a way of finding its way back home. You were right. It did." Outside, the wind carried the scent of lavender and earth, the same scent that had once filled their home when he was alive. Grace closed her eyes and let it wash over her. In that moment, she didn't feel the ache of loss. She felt the peace of continuity of knowing that the story she and Thomas had begun all those years ago had finally found its closing line. And somewhere in a quiet city apartment, Nathan Carter sat before his typewriter again, writing the final paragraph of his book. Sometimes home isn't where you were born. It's where the kindness you inherit finally leads you. He paused, smiling through tears, and whispered into the stillness, "For you, Mom, and for the Ellingtons, who made sure I found my way. 6 months passed. Winter had come and gone, leaving behind a soft trail of renewal across the Ellington farmhouse. The fields, once frozen under pale frost, now shimmered with the first signs of spring delicate blossoms pushing through the thawing soil, sunlight filtering through the willow trees, and the faint hum of life returning to every corner of the land. Grace Ellington moved through her days with quiet contentment. The ache of Nathan's absence had softened into something gentle, the kind of missing that didn't hurt, only reminded. Every once in a while, she'd catch herself setting an extra cup on the table, or pausing by the sound of a distant typewriter that wasn't really there. But instead of sorrow, she smiled. Because what remained was gratitude. She had received several letters from Nathan over those months, each one handwritten, each more heartfelt than the last. He wrote about his meetings in the city, about the thrill of seeing his manuscript come to life, and about the strange comfort he found in the thought of a farmhouse that still waited for him, even from miles away. Dear Mrs. Ellington, they've decided to publish it, The House That Remembered. They said it felt too honest to be fiction. Maybe that's because it isn't. Every page is filled with pieces of you, of Thomas, of this place. I think people need stories like yours, stories that remind them that kindness isn't just an act, it's a legacy. I'll visit soon. Please keep my room just as it is. It feels like the only place in the world that knows me. Nathan Grace read that letter so many times she could recite it by heart. Sometimes, when she sat on the porch in the evenings, she'd close her eyes and imagine him there, the sound of his laughter carried by the breeze, his silhouette framed by the sunset as it dipped beyond the hills. Sophie visited often now. She brought flowers from the market and stories from the city. Grace loved those afternoons, mother and daughter sharing tea and warmth in the same kitchen that once felt too large for one. Did you see the news? Sophie asked one day, flipping open her tablet. Nathan's book is everywhere. It's on the bestseller list. Grace smiled, eyes twinkling. He deserves it. Sophie grinned. He mentioned you in his interviews, Mom. Said the book wouldn't have existed without the kindness of a woman who reminded him that some homes still open their doors to strangers. Grace laughed softly, her hand brushing over the table. He always had a way with words. Later that evening, when Sophie left, Grace sat alone in the living room, her gaze drifting to the mantel where a new framed photograph stood, a newspaper clipping featuring Nathan at a book signing, smiling shyly beneath the headline, "The House That Remembered a Story of Hope, Home, and Humanity." The pride in her chest felt almost maternal. It was strange how life had brought them together, strangers bound by an act of kindness from decades ago. She often thought of Thomas, of how one small moment of compassion had rippled so far beyond their lifetime. A week later, Grace received a call. The number was unfamiliar, but the voice on the other end made her heart skip. "Mrs. Ellington?" "Nathan," she breathed, smiling. "It's so good to hear your voice." "I was hoping I'd catch you," he said, his tone warm and full. "I'm coming home this weekend, if that's still what I can call it." Grace's voice trembled slightly. "It'll always be home, Nathan. Always." The next 2 days passed in a gentle flurry. She baked pies, polished the old silverware, and even brought fresh flowers into the house. It wasn't about impressing him. It was about welcoming back a piece of the story that had changed her life. When Nathan's car pulled into the driveway that Saturday afternoon, Grace was already standing on the porch, her shawl fluttering softly in the breeze. He stepped out taller somehow, more confident, but still carrying that same quiet kindness in his eyes. "You look wonderful," she said, her voice warm. "So do you," he replied, smiling. "It feels like nothing's changed." Some things shouldn't, Grace said softly. Come in. Inside, everything felt exactly as it had the day he left his room. Neat, the smell of fresh bread wafting through the air. Nathan placed a package on the table and handed it to her. What's this? Grace asked. An advance copy, he said, his grin boyish. It's yours. She opened it carefully. The book's cover was simple yet elegant in illustration of a white farmhouse beneath a wide golden sky. Beneath the title was a dedication. For Grace and Thomas Ellington, whose kindness built a house that remembered me. Grace's eyes filled with tears. Nathan... He shook his head softly. You don't need to say anything. I wouldn't have found myself or this story without you. They sat together for hours that evening, talking about everything and nothing. The conversation flowed effortlessly, like it always had. Grace asked about the book tour, the people he'd met, the places he'd seen. Nathan asked about the garden, the village, and Sophie. As twilight fell, Nathan stood and walked to the window, gazing out at the fields glowing under the last light of day. You know, he said quietly, I used to think home was something you had to find. But I've realized it's something you make, moment by moment, person by person. Grace joined him by the window, her voice soft. You made it, Nathan, and you kept it alive. He turned to her then, eyes full of warmth. No, Mrs. Ellington. You did. Outside, the wind carried the scent of blooming lilacs through the open window. The house, bathed in golden light, felt timeless, like it had been waiting for. This reunion, for this sense of peace to settle once more within its walls. And as evening folded into night, Grace thought of Thomas, whispering into the quiet air. We didn't just build a home, my love. We built a story that will outlive us. Nathan smiled as though he'd heard her, his voice gentle, and it's still being written. The next morning dawned golden and peaceful, sunlight spilling through the curtains of the Ellington farmhouse like warm memory. Grace woke to the faint scent of coffee drifting through the hallway, followed by the soft sound of someone humming. She smiled before she even opened her eyes. Nathan. She found him in the kitchen, sleeves rolled up, humming as he whisked pancake batter with a clumsy grace that made her chuckle. Careful, she said, teasingly, leaning against the doorway. You'll end up redecorating my kitchen if you keep whisking that fast. He turned, smiling sheepishly. Morning, Mrs. Ellington. I thought I'd return the favor all those breakfasts you made for me. Grace raised an eyebrow, impressed. And what exactly are you planning to serve? Pancakes, or something that looks vaguely like them, he admitted. You can't judge until you taste them. Grace laughed, the sound light and genuine. I promise nothing. The morning flowed easily, laughter mixing with the smell of warm batter and maple syrup. For Grace, it was more than breakfast. It was a moment suspended in time, a glimpse of what life might have been if Thomas had lived longer, if Sophie had stayed closer, if their home had always been this full. After they ate, Nathan cleared the dishes while Grace tended to her garden. She could hear him through the open window, softly reading aloud from a book his own. He was practicing for an upcoming interview, and his voice carried a calm assurance that made her heart swell. Sometimes the smallest kindnesses ripple through generations. We build homes, not from bricks and wood, but from the love we leave behind. Grace paused, wiping her hands on her apron, her chest tightening with emotion. That's Thomas, she thought. That's us. Nathan joined her outside a few minutes later, kneeling by the flower beds. You've kept the garden alive, he said quietly. I remember when it was just soil and weeds. Grace smiled faintly. Everything grows when it's cared for, even the things you think are gone. He looked at her then, a small, reverent smile crossing his face. That's going in the next book. Then make sure you quote me properly, she teased. They both laughed, but the laughter carried something deeper, a mutual knowing that what had once been loss had now become legacy. As the afternoon stretched on, Sophie arrived, her usual energy softened by the countryside air. She greeted Nathan with a hug that no longer carried the careful distance of politeness. I read your book again, she told him. Twice. Think I cried both times? Nathan smiled, eyes glinting. Then I did my job. Sophie turned to her mother. I brought something for both of you. She handed Grace a small box wrapped in white paper and tied with a gold ribbon. Grace unwrapped it slowly, revealing a framed photograph, one she hadn't seen before. It was taken the day Nathan first moved in. The three of them standing by the porch, sunlight in their eyes, unguarded smiles on their faces. Sophie's voice softened. I had it printed from one of the photos on my phone. I thought you'd both want a reminder. Grace's throat tightened as she traced the outline of the frame. It's beautiful, darling. Thank you. Nathan nodded. I'll never forget that day. They sat on the porch that evening, the photo resting on the table between them. The light turned amber, then rose, then faded into the quiet indigo of twilight. Sophie had to leave soon, and Nathan would head back to the city in the morning, but for now, none of them rushed. You know, Sophie said softly, I used to think this house was just old, tired. I never understood why you refused to sell it, Mom, but now I get it. Grace looked at her, smiling faintly. It was never just a house, Sophie. It was a promise. To who? Sophie asked gently. To your father, Grace said, her voice steady. That I'd keep what we built alive, not just the walls, but the kindness inside them. Sophie reached for her mother's hand. You've done that, more than you know. Nathan looked between them, something tender flickering in his eyes. You've done that for me, too. I came here lost, Mrs. Ellington. But this place, you, both of you, you gave me something I didn't even realize I was missing roots. Grace's eyes shimmered, then we're even. You gave us something, too, a reason to believe the world still remembers gentle people. The three sat in silence, the kind that speaks louder than words. Fireflies began to dance in the tall grass, and somewhere in the distance, an owl called out, low and soft. Finally, Sophie broke the stillness. Do you think Dad would be proud? Grace smiled toward the horizon, where the last streaks of daylight faded into violet. He already is. Nathan nodded slowly, his gaze distant but full of peace. He built this house with his hands, but it was your heart that kept it standing. Grace chuckled softly, blinking back tears. And here, I thought I was done with crying over men's kind words. Nathan laughed, leaning back in his chair. You'll have to get used to it. There's an entire chapter about you now. Oh dear, Grace sighed playfully. I hope you didn't tell the world about my terrible pies? Only the first one, he teased. The rest were perfect. As the evening deepened, Sophie went inside to pack a few things for her drive home. Nathan and Grace stayed on the edge of the porch, the night wrapping gently around them. Grace turned to him quietly. You know, Nathan, sometimes I think people don't come into our lives to change us. They come to remind us who we've always been. Nathan smiled faintly. Then I guess you reminded me I was never truly alone. She looked out at the stars, her heart full. And you reminded me that home isn't about who leaves, it's about who finds their way back. The crickets sang, the porch light glowed softly, and the old farmhouse stood steady beneath the endless sky, a testament to love, memory, and the timeless truth that kindness never really ends. The next morning dawned with the golden stillness that comes before a goodbye. The house was quiet, not the heavy quiet of loneliness, but the gentle hush that falls when life pauses to remember something sacred. Grace moved slowly through the kitchen, her robe trailing softly against the floor, the air rich with the smell of brewed coffee and sunlight. Nathan's suitcase sat by the door. It looked smaller than before, though Grace suspected that was because she now saw him as part of the house, itself a missing piece that had finally clicked into place. He was sitting at the table, reading through a few handwritten notes. When he looked up, he smiled, though his eyes were heavy. "Morning, Mrs. Ellington." Grace smiled faintly. "You know, I keep telling you, call me Grace." Nathan's grin widened, warm and teasing. "I try, but it never feels right. Grace sounds too soft for you. You're stronger than the name lets on." She laughed, shaking her head. "You flatterer, I'll miss that." He took a sip of coffee, his tone gentle. "I'll miss a lot more than that." Grace joined him at the table, folding her hands. "You know, Nathan, I think this is the part I used to dread, the quiet that follows after people leave. But this time, it feels different." "How so?" he asked. "Because I know it's not the end," she said simply. "You've built something that carries us with you. Every page you wrote, it's a piece of this home, of Thomas, of your mother, of me. You've made sure that even when we're gone, some part of us will still be speaking." Nathan looked down at his hands, emotion tightening his throat. "You know, I never told you this, but when I was little, my mother used to read me bedtime stories. She always ended them the same way. She'd say, 'And somewhere in the world, there's someone who needed this story tonight.' I think about that a lot." Grace smiled, her eyes shimmering. "Then she'd be proud of you. You've written a story the world needed." He looked up, eyes full of quiet reverence. "Only because I found it here." For a long while, they sat in silence, the only sound the ticking of the old clock Thomas had repaired decades ago. The air felt thick with memory, not sad, just full. When it was finally time to go, Grace walked him to the porch. The morning sun washed everything in gold, the fields rippling gently in the breeze. Nathan paused by the doorway, taking in every detail, the white railing, the chipped paint, the faint creak of the wind chime. "This house," he said softly. "It feels like it's breathing again." "It always was," Grace replied, smiling. "It just needed someone to listen." Nathan turned toward her, his voice low. "You've changed my life, Grace. I hope you know that." She reached up, her hand resting briefly on his cheek in a gesture both motherly and timeless. "No, Nathan. You reminded me that it wasn't over yet, that even after loss, there's still something left to give." He covered her hand with his own. "You gave me a place to belong." She smiled, tears glistening. "And you gave me a reason to believe kindness still circles back." They stood there for a moment longer, neither wanting to break the stillness. Finally, Nathan picked up his suitcase and took a slow step down the porch steps. "I'll be back," he said quietly. "I know," she replied, "but take your time. The house and I aren't going anywhere." He smiled that same gentle smile she had come to think of as sunlight in human form, then turned toward his car. Grace watched until the dust from the gravel road settled and the sound of the engine faded into the wind. Then she stepped back inside. The house felt quiet again, but this time it wasn't empty. It was full of every word spoken, every kindness exchanged, every unspoken promise that lingered between the walls. Later that afternoon, Sophie called. "Did he leave already?" Grace nodded, smiling softly. "He did, but he'll be back." "I think he left a piece of himself there," Sophie said. Grace looked out at the garden, the tulips blooming in full color. "He left something better?" she said. "He left his story?" That evening, Grace sat by the fireplace, Nathan's book resting open in her lap. Her reading glasses slid slightly down her nose as she traced a line on the page. "Kindness doesn't end when we walk away. It takes root in the hearts of those who needed it most and blooms long after we're gone." Her eyes misted, and she whispered softly, "You've done well, Nathan." The wind outside carried the scent of lilacs through the window. The fire crackled softly. Grace leaned back in her chair, closing her eyes, feeling Thomas's presence in the warmth, hearing Nathan's voice in the rhythm of the fire. Somewhere deep in her heart, she knew this was the kind of ending Thomas would have loved. Not a farewell, but a full circle. And as the clock chimed softly in the distance, Grace whispered to the quiet room, "Thank you for finding your way home." In the city, Nathan sat by his window overlooking the skyline, a single lamp illuminating his desk. On the wall beside him hung a framed photograph of the farmhouse Grace, standing on the porch, waving, her shawl fluttering like wings. He smiled, picked up his pen, and began to write again the first words of a new story. It started with a rented room and became a home. And somewhere in the heart of a quiet farmhouse, Grace Ellington smiled because even in silence, she could almost hear the soft tapping of a typewriter echoing once more. Spring melted softly into early summer, bringing with it longer days and slower evenings that lingered like memories unwilling to fade. The farmhouse seemed to glow differently now, lighter, warmer, as if years of grief had finally given way to peace. Grace Ellington moved through it with an ease she hadn't known in decades. Her steps unhurried, her heart no longer weighed down by what was missing, but lifted by what remained. Nathan's absence was felt, but not painfully. His presence lingered in the smallest details. The faint scent of old books in his room, the notepad he'd forgotten by the window, the framed photograph of him, Grace, and Sophie on the porch. It wasn't emptiness he'd left behind, it was fullness, a reminder that kindness, once given, multiplies. One morning, a letter arrived. It was thick, sealed with navy wax, and addressed in familiar handwriting. Grace smiled before even opening it. "Dear Grace, I promised I'd come back, didn't I? Well, I'll be home soon if you'll still have me. The publisher wants me to write another book, and I can't imagine writing it anywhere else. The city's too loud, too fast. Every time I try to start a sentence, I hear the echo of your wind chimes and the creak of the porch instead. That's how I know where I belong. Also, there's someone I want you to meet. Someone who's been wanting to thank you for a long time, though she doesn't know it yet. I'll explain when I arrive." All my love, Nathan. Grace held the letter against her heart, smiling through tears. She whispered softly to the empty kitchen, "You always find your way home, don't you?" When Sophie stopped by later that week, Grace showed her the letter. Her daughter's face lit up. "He's coming back?" "Yes," Grace replied, her voice trembling slightly with joy. "And he's bringing someone with him." "Someone?" Sophie raised an eyebrow, a playful glint in her eye. "Do you think he's—" Grace chuckled, shaking her head. "Whatever it is, it'll be wonderful. It always is with Nathan." 2 days later, on a warm Sunday afternoon, Grace stood on the porch once more. The road stretched out ahead, shimmering in the sunlight. She could hear the distant hum of a car engine long before it appeared. When it finally did, her heart lifted that familiar blue sedan, dust rising behind it, slowing to a stop in front of the house. Nathan stepped out, smiling wide, his eyes brighter than ever. He looked the same, yet more grounded, as if life had finally settled kindly around him. But this time, he wasn't alone. The passenger door opened, and a young woman emerged. She was in her mid-20s, her auburn hair tied back in a loose braid, her face soft with curiosity and nervousness. She held a bouquet of wildflowers, the same kind that grew by the Ellington fields. "Grace?" Nathan said, walking toward her. "This is Lily." Grace's smile widened. "Hello, Lily." The young woman returned the smile, though shyly. "It's such an honor to meet you. Nathan's told me so much about you, I feel like I already know you." Grace chuckled, taking her hand warmly. "All good things, I hope." "Only good," Nathan said, grinning. "Lily's a journalist. She wrote one of the first reviews of my book, the one that got everyone's attention. We've been working together ever since." Lily blushed faintly. "Nathan wanted me to see where it all began." Grace's eyes softened. "Then you've come to the right place." They spent the afternoon walking through the garden, the air fragrant with roses and mint. Nathan showed Lily the porch where he'd first arrived, the spot by the window where he'd written his first pages, and the field where he'd learned that silence could be comforting, not lonely. As the three of them sat for tea, Sophie arrived, her car door slamming shut as she waved from the drive. "I knew it. I knew you'd be back," she called, running up the steps to hug Nathan. He laughed. "It's good to see you, Sophie." The four of them sat together at the old oak table. Grace, Sophie, Nathan, and Lily, the house alive with laughter and light conversation. Grace looked around the room and felt something she hadn't felt since her younger years. Family. "Do you remember?" Sophie said, leaning back in her chair. "When I first told you I rented out your room, Mom, you nearly fainted." Grace laughed. "I thought you'd lost your mind?" "Maybe I had," Sophie replied, smiling toward Nathan. "But it turns out it was the best decision I ever made." Nathan looked down at his teacup, his voice quiet but sincere. "It changed everything for me, too. That single choice, that chance, gave me my life back." Lily smiled at him softly and gave a lot of readers hope, too. Grace reached out, her hand brushing his. That's what kindness does. It keeps moving from one heart to the next. As evening settled, Nathan stood by the doorway, gazing at the horizon glowing in orange and gold. "You know," he said thoughtfully, "I've been thinking about what to call the next book." "Oh?" Grace asked. "And what will it be?" He turned to her, eyes warm. "The House That Kept Its Promise." Grace's breath caught for a moment, then she smiled. "That sounds just right." Nathan nodded. "Because this place, you kept every promise, to Thomas, to me, to the world." The crickets began to sing as dusk deepened, and the air filled with the scent of lilacs once again. Grace looked around, her daughter smiling, Nathan content, Lily bright-eyed and hopeful, and she knew without doubt that the story of their house would continue long after she was gone. She raised her teacup in a quiet toast. "To kindness," she said softly. "May it always find its way home." Nathan lifted his cup, meeting her gaze. "To home," he echoed. "The kind that remembers us, even when we forget ourselves." The farmhouse glowed in the fading light, its windows reflecting the golden sky. The laughter inside spilled gently into the evening air, mingling with the hum of summer and the whisper of history repeating itself, not in sorrow, but in grace. Summer unfolded like a soft hymn, slow, radiant, and alive. The Ellington farmhouse, once heavy with the stillness of memory, now thrummed with laughter, stories, and the gentle music of belonging. Grace could feel it everywhere, in the scent of bread baking in the kitchen, in the clinking of teacups, in the quiet murmur of voices drifting from the porch at dusk. It was as if time itself had stopped to watch what kindness had rebuilt. Nathan and Lily had decided to stay for a while. What was meant to be a weekend visit stretched into weeks. They wrote together in the mornings, Nathan typing steadily at his desk while Lily edited beside him, her handwriting looping gracefully in the margins. In the afternoons, they helped Grace in the garden, pulling weeds and laughing over crooked rows of tomatoes. Sophie came often now too, each visit leaving a little more of the city's rush behind. One evening, the four of them sat outside under a canopy of stars. The fields glowed silver in the moonlight, and the air smelled faintly of mint and earth. Nathan had brought out his guitar, an old, scuffed instrument he claimed he hadn't played in years, and strummed a quiet melody that filled the night with something both tender and eternal. Grace leaned back in her rocking chair, the shawl around her shoulders fluttering in the breeze. "Thomas used to play," she said softly. "He'd sit right there on those steps and sing to Sophie before bed." Sophie smiled. "I remember. He always sang off key, but I didn't care." Nathan laughed quietly. "Then I'm in good company." Lily's voice joined his, soft and steady, humming a tune that seemed older than the stars. Grace closed her eyes, letting the sound wash over her. In that moment, the world felt perfectly still. No past, no future, just the quiet rhythm of hearts beating in the same space. When the last note faded, Nathan looked over at Grace. "You know, I was thinking about something you said before about how kindness never really ends. I think you're right." Grace opened her eyes, smiling. "It's not something I said, Nathan. It's something I learned from living long enough to see it come back around." He nodded thoughtfully. "That's what I want this next book to be about. Not just promises kept, but kindness passed on from one generation to the next. The way it ripples through people, changing lives without them even knowing." Lily reached for his hand, her expression tender. "You already know how to tell that story." Nathan looked at her, then at Grace, "Only because I saw it here." The conversation faded into a comfortable silence, the kind that felt like peace. Fireflies blinked lazily in the tall grass, and the steady chirp of crickets filled the air. Grace looked around her at Nathan and Lily sitting side by side, at Sophie, with her head tilted toward the stars, and realized she was witnessing something she had only ever prayed for: the continuation of love. Days turned into weeks, and by August, the second book was nearly finished. Nathan often read parts of it aloud at the kitchen table while Grace kneaded dough or Sophie sorted flowers from the garden. "Kindness," he read one morning, "is the only inheritance that grows richer, the more it's given away." Grace paused, her hands covered in flour, eyes glistening. "That sounds like something Thomas would have said." "Maybe he did," Nathan said softly. "Maybe we're all just rewriting each other's stories." Later that afternoon, Sophie helped Lily paint the old garden fence while Nathan sat with Grace on the porch. A gentle wind stirred the wind chimes above them, their soft notes carrying across the fields. "You know," Grace said quietly, "when Sophie told me she rented out my room, I thought it was the worst thing she could have done." Nathan smiled, eyes warm. "And now?" Grace chuckled. "Now I think it was divine intervention." He laughed, nodding. "I guess some stories start in the strangest ways." Grace's smile softened. "Thomas always said you can't control how life begins, but you can decide what kind of ending it deserves." Nathan looked at her for a long moment. "Then I think this story's ending beautifully." That night, Lily made dinner: roasted vegetables, fresh bread, and apple crumble for dessert. They ate by candlelight, laughter filling the spaces between stories. When the last candle burned low, Grace excused herself for a moment, returning with something wrapped carefully in a linen cloth. She handed it to Nathan. "This was Thomas's," she said softly. "He used it every night when he wrote in his journal. I think it's time it belonged to someone else who writes from the heart." Nathan unfolded the cloth to reveal an old fountain pen. Its metal dulled with age, but still elegant. His voice caught. "Grace, I can't take this." "Yes, you can," she said gently. "It's meant to keep telling stories, not to gather dust." He held the pen reverently, his throat tight. "Thank you for trusting me with it." Grace smiled. "You've earned it." Later, when everyone had gone to bed, Grace sat by the window, watching the moonlight spill across the fields. The house was quiet, yet she could still feel the hum of life within it, the echo of laughter, the warmth of voices, the pulse of something sacred and enduring. She thought of Thomas, of the years they'd built together, and whispered into the night, "We did it, love. We kept the promise." Down the hall, Nathan sat at his desk, the old fountain pen gliding smoothly across the page. He was writing the final chapter. His words flowed effortlessly, as though the house itself was guiding his hand. Some homes aren't built of wood and stone, but of hearts that choose to stay open. And sometimes, if you listen closely, you can hear them breathe, not with age, but with grace. When he finished, he placed the pen beside the manuscript, exhaled deeply, and looked toward the darkened hallway. He smiled, knowing that somewhere beyond that door, Grace Ellington slept peacefully, her story, and Thomas's, finally complete. Autumn came quietly, as it always did, with leaves turning amber, and the air carrying that faint chill of reflection. The Ellington farmhouse stood steady under the wide sky, wrapped in the same golden calm that had watched over generations. Inside, everything remained alive, not because of noise or emotion, but because of memory, kindness, and the quiet miracle of stories shared. Grace Ellington had grown slower that season. Her steps were softer now, her breaths more deliberate, but her spirit, that warm, radiant light, burned just as bright. Sophie came by almost every day, bringing soups, flowers, and updates about Nathan's second book, which had already begun stirring anticipation. Lily called often too, sending photos from their city readings, where crowds gathered to hear Nathan's voice fill rooms with the same sincerity that had once filled this house. But Nathan always called on Sundays, never missed one. This Sunday was no different. The phone rang just as the sun slipped below the fields. Grace answered, smiling at the sound of his familiar voice. "Grace," he said warmly, "I have news. The new book is done, and it's dedicated to you again." She laughed softly, tears glimmering. "Nathan Carter, you'll make me vain if you keep doing that." He chuckled. "It's not vanity. It's truth. You're the heart of every page." There was a pause, the kind filled with emotion words can't quite hold. "I'm coming home next weekend," he said finally, "to bring you a copy myself." Grace's voice trembled. "Then I'll have tea waiting." That night, she sat by the fire with the old pen Nathan still used, framed beside his photograph. She looked at Thomas's chair and whispered, "You see, love, it all found its way back, the kindness, the laughter, the living." The fire crackled softly, its glow painting her face in gold. Outside, the wind stirred gently as if the house itself sighed contentedly. A week later, Nathan returned, walking up the familiar path with a small package in hand. Sophie opened the door, smiling through tears. "She's been waiting for you," she said. Nathan stepped inside quietly. The house smelled like cinnamon and lavender, exactly as he remembered. In the living room, Grace sat by the window, shawl over her shoulders, the light framing her in warmth. Her eyes lifted to meet his, and for a long moment, no words were needed. "You kept your promise," she said softly. "So did you," he replied. He handed her the book, The House That Kept Its Promise. The dedication on the first page read, For Grace Ellington, who taught me that love never leaves, it only changes its shape. Grace traced the words with trembling fingers. It's beautiful, she whispered. You did it, Nathan. You've built something that will last. He smiled, tears in his eyes. You did that first. They sat together in silence as the sun dipped low, painting the farmhouse in honeyed light. Their house seemed to breathe around them, alive with every kindness ever spoken within its walls. And as the wind moved through the fields beyond, Grace closed her eyes, her hand resting over Nathan's. Her voice was barely a whisper, but it carried everything that needed to be said. Welcome home. The wind chimes sang softly, the last light fading into the horizon, and the Ellington farmhouse, timeless and true, stood as it always had, a keeper of stories, a vessel of love, and a home that remembered.